Thanks for clicking enjoy the full story. It was supposed to be a simple drive. My weekend routine had always been predictable: grab groceries at the Aldi on Main Street, maybe swing by the hardware store to browse for tools I didn't really need, and head home to spend the afternoon fixing things around the house. Those weekends were my escape from the grind of the office. A place where deadlines loomed like storm clouds and meetings dragged on endlessly, often for reasons I'd later forget. I enjoyed the quiet of my routine, the mundane satisfaction of crossing off to-do lists, keeping my hands busy, my mind focused. The garage had always been my personal retreat. Whether I was sanding down the old rocking chair I found at a yard sale last summer or trying, and usually failing, to fix the lawn mower, it was where I felt most at peace. It wasn't exciting, but it was mine. It was predictable, reliable, a small oasis of order in a world that rarely offered either. But today, that simple routine unraveled faster than I could have imagined. The highway was packed. The traffic was a sea of cars, bumper to bumper. The sun blazed down, the air shimmering in the heat. The frustration of the drivers was palpable, and I could feel it too. It was a typical Saturday, everybody heading out to take care of their errands, their weekend plans, and me, just trying to get home before the afternoon heat started to bake everything inside the car. I was driving my old sedan, slightly battered from years of use but still dependable. I shifted gears, trying to merge into the middle lane. My mirrors were checked, and I glanced over my shoulder, slowly but steadily making my move. That's when I heard it, the blaring horn. My heart jumped. I jerked the wheel, barely correcting my lane enough to avoid a collision. The sound of the horn echoed in my ears. A shiny black SUV swerved slightly behind me, and for a moment, I thought the situation was going to pass with nothing more than a shared look of annoyance. I braced myself for the tension to subside. But no, it didn't. The SUV sped up, pulling alongside me. I could see the driver's face clearly now, his features twisted with fury, his mouth moving in what I could only assume was a stream of expletives. Through his tinted window, I could barely make out the wild gestures he was throwing my way. I sighed, my grip tightening on the wheel. I raised my hand in an apologetic wave, hoping that simple acknowledgement would ease the tension. It didn't. If anything, it made him angrier. The SUV swerved closer, almost as if trying to intimidate me, then pulled back just before contact. I could feel the space between us shrink, the invisible boundary of personal space violated. My heart was racing now, my mind wrestling with the impulse to just ignore him. But he wasn't letting up. He darted in and out of traffic, staying close to my car, constantly honking the horn, a sharp, shrill reminder of his presence. At that moment, I wished I were anywhere but here. The highway felt like a battleground. My car became a fortress, surrounded by a growing wall of tension. Other drivers seemed to sense the hostility in the air and kept their distance. The space around us became almost sacred. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was the emotional gap too. The drivers around us gave us a wide berth, like spectators at a boxing match, not wanting to get involved. The other driver wasn't relenting. He kept darting in and out of lanes, forcing his way forward with a level of aggression that felt entirely unnecessary. I could see his eyes in my peripheral vision. His anger was palpable. He was obsessed with the idea that I had wronged him. Every time I tried to change lanes, he would maneuver aggressively to cut me off, almost forcing me into the shoulder. Every time I had to slam the brakes. The whole scene felt juvenile, reckless, and utterly exhausting. My pulse quickened. I didn't need this. I thought about my daughter, Emily. She had just passed her driving test a few weeks ago. I'd lectured her endlessly about road rage, about keeping calm behind the wheel, about how a moment's lapse in judgment could escalate into something worse. And here I was, barely holding it together myself. Lead by example, I muttered under my breath, trying to steady my hands on the wheel. But I could feel my anger rising as the SUV loomed in my mirrors. We both took the same exit, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. My heart sank lower when I realized we were heading toward the same gas station. I could feel the beads of sweat forming on my forehead, despite the air conditioning. I glanced at the fuel gauge. My tank was dangerously close to empty. The odds of me avoiding this encounter were slim. Just my luck, I muttered to myself. The gas station, Sunoco, was just as packed as the highway had been, with every pump occupied. I pulled into the first available spot, my fingers numb from gripping the steering wheel. Stepping out of my car, I glanced over at the SUV. Sure enough, it was pulling into the pump directly across from me. My stomach dropped. The air around me felt thick with the unspoken tension. I didn't even bother looking up as I unscrewed the gas cap, knowing his gaze was fixed on me. I could feel his glare like a hot spotlight. I wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but I could already tell this guy, Mike, was looking for one. The sound of his car door slamming shut echoed in the otherwise quiet station. He marched toward me, his fists clenched, his face twisted with rage. "Hey, you think you own the road?" he yelled, his voice cutting through the usual hum of engines and the occasional clink of a gas nozzle. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Look, Mike," I waved. I said I was sorry. "What else do you want?" I asked, trying to defuse the situation. He stepped closer, his body language aggressive, his anger only growing with every word. "I want you to pay attention next time. You could have caused an accident." I felt the frustration start to bubble beneath the surface. I wanted to snap, to match his energy and maybe even goad him into a physical confrontation. But I didn't. I stayed calm. I didn't. No one got hurt. Can we just let it go? I could feel the eyes of bystanders on us. An elderly man named Bob at the next pump shot me an annoyed look before muttering, "Here we go again." A teenager, no older than my daughter, was already discreetly recording the encounter on his phone. My sense of unease grew. This wasn't just a confrontation now, it was an audience. The argument was escalating fast. Mike's face had turned a deep shade of red, and his fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was standing so close to me now, I could feel his breath on my face, each word laced with more venom. My pulse quickened, the tension between us reaching a boiling point. I knew it could go from bad to worse in a matter of seconds. His voice cut through the air, sharp and aggressive. "You think you can just cut me off and get away with it?" he shouted. "You could have caused an accident back there, and now you're acting like nothing happened?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The anger was rising in me, but I fought it back. This was a situation I didn't want to escalate. My hand instinctively reached for the edge of my car, my fingers brushing the metal as if it could provide me some semblance of grounding. My patience was wearing thin, but I had to stay composed. It wasn't just about me now, there were bystanders watching, some shaking their heads, others glancing nervously. The last thing I needed was to make a scene. I met Mike's gaze head on, my voice calm but firm. "Mike, I said I was sorry," I repeated. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble. No one got hurt. Can we just move on from this?" My words were measured, but I could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The desire to throw a sharp remark back at him was strong, but I resisted. Mike's eyes narrowed, and he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. "You think just saying sorry makes everything better?" he sneered. "You think that absolves you of nearly causing a wreck? You're just as bad as all the other idiots on the road, thinking they own it." I didn't know why it bothered me so much. Maybe it was the venom in his tone, or maybe it was the way he was now standing in my personal space, refusing to back down. I could see the anger in his eyes, but I also saw something else, a kind of frustration that seemed to consume him. It wasn't just about the lane change anymore. It felt like it was about something deeper, something more personal to him. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, I noticed a figure approaching us from the corner of my eye. It was the gas station manager, Tom. He was walking toward us with purpose, a stern look on his face. I could tell by the way he moved that he was no stranger to situations like this. In fact, he probably dealt with them on a weekly basis. Hey, not here," Tom called out as he closed the distance between us. His voice was authoritative, cutting through the rising tension like a sharp knife. He wasn't shouting, but there was no mistaking the command in his tone. His expression was one of practiced exasperation, as if he had dealt with too many of these scenarios before. Mike stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Tom for a brief moment, his face still contorted in anger, but something in Tom's presence seemed to hold him back. Mike turned his head, visibly frustrated, but he didn't speak. For a brief moment, I thought he might take another swing at me, or worse, escalate the confrontation further. Tom, however, wasn't having any of it. "If you want to fight, take it somewhere else," he continued, his voice even but firm. "But if you're staying here, I suggest you calm down and act like a grown-up. We're not doing this in front of my customers." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mike opened his mouth, probably ready to snap back at Tom, but he hesitated. The manager wasn't backing down, and that seemed to make Mike stop for a moment and reassess. He clenched his fists again, but this time he didn't move closer. He was angry, but he was no fool. He could see that Tom wasn't the type of guy to let things slide. Tom, seeing the opportunity, pressed his advantage. "Look," he said, pointing toward the pumps. "You've got a car to fill up, and I've got a business to run. If you don't want to be here, then leave. But if you're staying, let's get this over with." Mike's face shifted, the anger giving way to something else, reluctance, maybe a hint of embarrassment. He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like a curse, but it wasn't loud enough for me to catch. I didn't respond. I wasn't about to give him another reason to lash out. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Tom stood there, unwavering, while Mike slowly backed away from me, his eyes still burning with frustration, but not quite as sharp as before. Mike glanced one last time at me, then at Tom, before turning back toward his SUV. As he walked off, Tom looked at me with a slight nod of acknowledgement. I gave him a grateful look, silently thanking him for stepping in when he did. But there was no time to savor the moment. The whole situation had already taken a toll on me. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and I could feel my muscles tense from the stress. My breathing was still a little heavy, my heart rate not yet back to normal. Tom's gaze softened as he turned back to me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, like he was checking in more than anything else. I nodded, managing a small, tight smile. "Yeah, thanks for that. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Tom waved it off. "Happens all the time. People forget their manners when they get behind the wheel, especially when they think no one's watching." He glanced over his shoulder, making sure Mike had actually left. "Some folks just don't know when to let it go, you know?" I nodded, agreeing more than I'd let on. I was relieved it hadn't turned into something worse. Mike had been on the edge, but Tom's intervention had defused the situation. I was grateful for the manager's quick thinking. Without it, I wasn't sure how things would have ended. Mike's SUV finally pulled out of the lot, tires screeching as he accelerated onto the road. For a moment I thought about the interaction, how quickly it could have gotten out of hand if not for Tom. I was glad it hadn't come to that. I didn't want to have to call the police or deal with a physical confrontation. Sometimes, it was just about keeping the peace, even if it meant swallowing your pride. Tom finished helping another customer, his eyes lingering on me for a second longer than usual. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that still clung to my chest. It was over. But for the rest of the day, I'd be thinking about how fragile that peace had been, and how quickly things could have gone wrong. I finished pumping my gas and slid the nozzle back into its cradle with a soft click. The click echoed in my mind, somehow louder than it should have been. It wasn't just the sound of a fuel pump being returned to its place, it was the symbol of the whole situation coming to a close. Or at least, I hoped it was. There was a lingering tension in the air, the kind you feel after a storm has passed, but the humidity still hangs heavy, making everything seem more suffocating. I glanced around, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. The gas station had returned to its regular hum, the normal buzz of everyday life. People came and went, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. The elderly man with the truck was still there, nodding at me as I finished up, his face now relaxed. I managed a half-hearted wave in his direction, but he didn't acknowledge it. The teenage girl who had been filming earlier was still there too, her phone now tucked away in her pocket. She didn't seem to care that the confrontation was over. She had gotten what she needed, a moment of drama, a story for later. Everyone else was going about their business, like nothing had happened. I, on the other hand, was still stewing in the aftereffects of the encounter. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly as I slid back into my car. My fingers ached from the tension, the muscles in my shoulders still tight from the adrenaline that had coursed through me just moments ago. The air felt thick inside my car, like it was trying to press down on me, suffocating me with all the pent-up frustration from the encounter. I let out a slow, steady breath, my exhale fogging up the windshield for a moment. It was like the physical world was still holding on to the anger, and I had to push through it to get out. As I started the engine, the low rumble filled the silence, but it was a hollow sound, devoid of comfort. The moment was still too fresh, the memory of Mike's scowl and the heat of his anger still burning in my mind. The encounter had ended, but it wasn't over. Not really. I was still replaying the scene in my head, wondering if there had been something I could have done differently. Should I have been more assertive? Should I have stood up for myself more in the moment, rather than letting Tom handle it? Or was the way I'd handled it the right call after all? I pulled out of the gas station, the tires of my sedan humming along the asphalt, but the sound was muted compared to the heavy weight on my chest. The city was sprawled out before me as I merged back onto the main road. The streets looked the same as always, mundane, ordinary, but now they seemed different, as though the world had shifted just slightly. The buildings, the trees, even the pedestrians walking along the sidewalk, they all felt like they were part of some elaborate backdrop, and I was the main character in an unfolding story. A story about road rage. A story about anger and frustration and the razor-thin line between control and chaos. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. I couldn't help but wonder about Mike. Who was he really? What was his life like outside of that brief moment of insanity? Was he always this angry, or had I just caught him on a bad day? I imagined his home, his own space where he might retreat to after work, just like I do when I'm tinkering with tools in my garage. Was it a place of peace, or was it filled with as much chaos as the road rage I just witnessed? Was he the type of guy who carried that anger with him, letting it fester and grow, or would he go home and calm down, quietly regretting his actions? And then I thought about Tom, the manager. What kind of person does it take to step in the way he had? To put himself between two strangers, knowing full well he might get caught in the crossfire of their dispute? I imagined Tom at the end of his day, his shift winding down, maybe heading home to his family or to his own quiet retreat. Was he ever bothered by these kinds of confrontations, or had he become numb to them over time? Was his firm intervention just routine, something he did without thinking, or was there more to it? Maybe he had his own demons that led him to be the kind of person who wasn't afraid to confront chaos head-on. My thoughts spiraled as I drove, each turn of the wheel taking me further away from the gas station, but not from the lingering emotions. The world outside was bustling with activity. Cars honking, pedestrians walking, the usual din of the city, but I felt detached from it all. I was in my own little bubble, processing everything that had just happened. The incident with Mike hadn't just rattled me in the moment. It had left a mark, a reminder of how fragile social interactions can be. How quickly the smallest spark of anger could ignite a fire, and how easily everything could go up in smoke. As I neared my neighborhood, I thought about my daughter again, how she had just gotten her driver's license a few months ago. I had spent hours teaching her the rules of the road, emphasizing patience, caution, and the importance of staying calm behind the wheel. I had told her stories of my own driving experiences, stories of close calls and near accidents, but I had always framed them as learning experiences. I didn't want her to learn through mistakes, I wanted her to be better than that. But now, in the wake of my own encounter with Mike, I wondered if I was setting the right example. I had stayed calm, for the most part, but had I truly handled the situation with the grace I had preached? I didn't know. I wasn't sure. But the uncertainty gnawed at me as I pulled into my driveway, the garage door creaking open as I parked my car. I sat there for a moment, just staring at the garage door, listening to the hum of the engine slowly fade away. The silence in my car felt like a reprieve, like I had just crossed some invisible line and was now on the other side of it. The anger, the tension, the adrenaline, it was all starting to drain away. But something was still there. A quiet, uncomfortable thought that lingered in the back of my mind. Had Mike learned anything from our confrontation? Or was he just going to drive away, his anger dissipating like smoke, only to be replaced by another spark at some other time, on some other road? I finally stepped out of my car, my legs feeling a little heavy from the weight of it all. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could exhale fully. Maybe I wasn't going to solve all the world's problems in one drive, but I could at least take a moment to let the dust settle. I walked into the house, the familiar sights of home grounding me, and for the first time since the incident, I felt the weight of the day start to lift. I wasn't sure if the lesson had been learned or if the cycle of road rage would continue. But for tonight at least, I was home. And that was enough.